When Richard Goodall first walked onto the America's Got Talent stage, he wasn't just another contestant. He was a quiet, humble school janitor with a voice powerful enough to stop the world in its tracks. His auditions stunned millions, and even the judges, especially Simon Cowell, seemed genuinely moved in a way viewers rarely saw. Overnight, Richard transformed from an overlooked everyday hero into a symbol of hope, reminding people everywhere that hidden talent can live in the most unexpected places. But behind that unforgettable performance and the smile that warmed the hearts of millions, there were rumors about personal struggles, emotional battles, and the things Richard had been carrying long before the world discovered him. For months, fans speculated. Videos circulated online, comments piled up, and people kept asking the same question. What is really going on with Richard Goodall? And why does Simon Cowell seem unusually protective of him? After staying silent for a long time, Simon has finally addressed those rumors. And what he revealed has left fans heartbroken. His words shine a light not only on Richard's emotional journey, but on the quiet pain he hid behind every performance. This isn't just a story about a singer who touched the world. It's a story about the weight he carried, the truth he never wanted to talk about, and the heartbreaking reality Simon Cowell confirmed at last. From the moment Richard Goodall stepped forward onto the stage, his presence felt different. There was no flashy wardrobe, no rehearsed persona, and no attempt to play the part of a typical talent show competitor. Instead, he stood there with the gentleness of someone who had spent years working quietly, unnoticed, and uncelebrated. A middle-aged school janitor who had dedicated his life to helping children, keeping hallways clean, and making sure classrooms were ready every morning. The contrast between the man and the moment could not have been more striking. Viewers felt it instantly. This wasn't just an audition. It was someone's life finally stepping into the light. And then he started singing. The first note carried a weight that made the audience stop breathing for a second. It wasn't just the power or clarity of his voice, it was the emotion inside it, something raw and deeply human. People later said they could feel decades of quiet struggle in that performance. The years of being overlooked, the nights spent wondering if dreams expire, the inner voice that kept saying, maybe it's too late. But Richard sang as if he wanted to prove that time hadn't taken away the fire in his heart. Even Simon Cowell, known for his brutal honesty and unshakable composure, looked stunned. Behind the scenes, it didn't take long for people to realize that Richard wasn't just a great singer. He was a man who had lived a life full of hardship, anxiety, and emotional challenges he rarely spoke about. Fellow contestants noticed how he often stood alone, quietly humming to himself, trying to keep calm before being called to perform. Crew members saw that he carried a softness and almost fragile quality that made him both inspiring and heartbreaking at the same time. Many assumed it was simply nerves, but others sensed something deeper. Rumors began circulating quickly. Some said he struggled with stage fright so severe that it nearly kept him from auditioning. Others claimed he had faced years of self-doubt, reinforced by people who told him he wasn't cut out for anything greater than cleaning floors. A few whispered that he had spent much of his life believing he would never be good enough to pursue music. And most painful of all were the quiet conversations about how emotionally overwhelming the sudden attention might be for him. Simon Cowell later admitted that from the moment Richard walked in, he sensed a vulnerability beneath the surface, one that few people could fully understand. Simon described him as a gentle soul who didn't believe he deserved the applause he was getting. At the time, these words were brushed off as compliments. But in hindsight, they hinted at cracks in Richard's emotional armor. As the weeks passed, Richard continued to amaze audiences. Yet, behind the camera, he struggled with the pressure more than anyone realized. Fame, even temporary fame, can be a heavy burden for someone who has spent their entire life in the background. Producers noticed that Richard seemed overwhelmed by crowds, lights, and the constant attention. He wasn't used to being the center of anything. And the sudden shift felt like too much too fast. Still, he pushed through every rehearsal, every interview, every moment where he felt his chest tighten with anxiety. He didn't want to disappoint the people rooting for him. He didn't want to prove the doubters right. And he especially didn't want to let down the children at his school, who saw him as a hero. Viewers only saw the polished final performances, not the man backstage fighting to steady his hands, struggling to breathe evenly, or whispering to himself, "You can do this." Just one more time. He carried more emotional weight than anyone could see, and for a long time, no one, not even the judges, truly understood just how heavy it was. It wasn't until much later, when Simon Cowell finally addressed the rumors, that fans learned the heartbreaking truth behind Richard Goodall's journey. As Richard Goodall's journey continued, it became clear that the sudden surge of attention was affecting him in ways that viewers couldn't see. Overnight, he went from being a quiet school janitor to someone recognized in grocery stores, stopped on sidewalks, and praised by strangers who had been moved to tears by his voice. And while most contestants dream of that kind of recognition, Richard wasn't prepared for the intensity that came with it. He was a simple man who had spent most of his life blending into the background. Someone who never imagined becoming the center of so much emotional investment. Fame didn't excite him, it terrified him. People around the show later revealed that Richard often appeared overwhelmed, especially in moments when cameras weren't rolling. He wasn't used to microphones placed in front of him, bright lights shining directly into his eyes, or producers asking him to repeat lines for clarity. Each small request, harmless to most, felt like pressure mounting on his shoulders. He worried constantly that he would make a mistake, lose his voice, or disappoint the millions rooting for him. Even when he smiled, there was a visible softness and uncertainty that hinted he was still trying to understand why people suddenly cared so much. What many didn't know was that Richard had spent years battling a deep sense of inadequacy. Growing up, he wasn't encouraged to pursue his passion. His voice remained something he used only when he felt safe inside his car, in the school gym after hours, or in the quiet corners of his home. Singing was a comfort, not a profession, and certainly not a path he thought he deserved to follow. So when the world finally heard him, he struggled to believe that the applause was real. The emotional toll of giving himself permission to be seen was heavier than anyone expected. Friends later revealed that Richard often felt guilty for taking up space, as though he didn't have the right to be on the same stage as performers who had chased their dreams for years. He would ask them quietly, "Do you really think I belong here?" It wasn't a rhetorical question. He genuinely didn't know. Simon Cowell noticed this long before most. During rehearsals, he occasionally watched from a distance, observing how Richard carried himself. While other contestants radiated confidence or excitement, Richard seemed almost apologetic for standing in the same room. Simon later said that he felt a protective instinct toward him, something he rarely experienced with contestants. He sensed the weight Richard carried, the emotional fragility behind the voice that millions had fallen in love with. Producers also saw the cracks forming. They noticed how Richard reacted when crowds cheered too loudly, or when interviewers asked personal questions. His breathing would shift, his hands would tremble slightly, and he would look for a quiet corner where he could gather himself. The attention, though positive, became emotionally overwhelming. It was as if Richard was trying to hold on to two versions of himself at once. The humble janitor who cleaned hallways every morning, and the unexpected superstar the world had suddenly embraced. The pressure only intensified as the competition progressed. Every week brought higher expectations, more cameras, and more eyes watching his every move. And the fear of failing slowly began to take root. Richard didn't fear losing the competition. He feared disappointing the millions who believed in him. That weight, silent, invisible, and constant, became harder to carry. Those who spoke to him behind the scenes said he was always kind, always grateful, always gentle. But beneath that kindness was a man fighting a battle no one could fully understand. He wasn't just singing on stage, he was fighting against years of self-doubt, anxiety, and the haunting belief that he didn't deserve success. His performances were more than music. They were moments of courage, and it was this emotional truth, this hidden struggle, that Simon Cowell finally decided the world needed to hear. As the show moved forward and Richard Goodall's performances continued to go viral, the world saw the triumph. But behind the scenes, the pressure was quietly wearing him down. He was stepping into a life he had never prepared for, and the speed at which everything changed left him trying to catch his breath. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from reporters, talent agents, and fans. Social media filled with his name overnight. People wanted interviews, backstories, reactions, behind-the-scenes clips, everything. That comes naturally to seasoned performers, but was completely foreign to someone who spent years avoiding large crowds. One producer later recalled how Richard reacted the first time a group of fans surrounded him in public. He froze completely. Not because he didn't appreciate them, he was genuinely grateful, but because he didn't know how to handle being seen. To him, recognition felt like a spotlight he wasn't built for. The overwhelmed expression on his face was something the crew had never forgotten, and then came the rumors. The internet loves building stories, especially when someone becomes an overnight sensation. Some fans speculated that Richard was dealing with health issues. Others believed he struggled with emotional exhaustion. A few even insisted he couldn't handle the pressure and was on the verge of backing out. These whispers, although unconfirmed, captured a painful truth. Richard was indeed battling something deeper. Simon Cowell, who typically avoids discussing contestants' personal struggles unless necessary, remained unusually quiet. But those closest to the show could tell that Simon was concerned. He often checked on Richard, asking how he felt, whether he needed time, and if the schedule was overwhelming. Unlike other contestants who craved more camera time, Richard often asked for less. He didn't want special treatment, he simply wanted to breathe. It wasn't until one rehearsal day that things reached a breaking point. Richard was preparing for a major performance, one that producers expected would be another viral moment. Cameras were set, lights were adjusted, and the stage was nearly ready. But Richard couldn't sing. His voice shook, his hands trembled, and his breathing turned shallow. Crew members said he looked like a man standing inside a storm he couldn't escape. He wasn't nervous about singing, he was emotionally exhausted from everything surrounding it. He sat down backstage, his head in his hands, whispering to himself that he didn't want to let anyone down. The weight of millions of expectations felt unbearable. When Simon arrived and found him visibly shaken, he sat beside him quietly. That moment wasn't captured on camera, but witnesses say Simon didn't lecture him or push him. Instead, he told him something simple: just be yourself. That's enough? It was one of the few times people saw Simon Cowell speak gently, almost protectively. As if he knew Richard wasn't just another contestant, he was someone who needed reassurance for reasons deeper than the competition. Despite the emotional pressure, Richard performed that night. His voice wavered for just a second, but the audience didn't notice. What they heard was heart and vulnerability, which only made viewers love him more. But Simon knew the truth, that Richard wasn't struggling with the competition itself, but with the emotional toll of suddenly being seen by millions after a lifetime of being invisible. After that performance, the rumors intensified. People questioned whether Richard was stable enough to handle fame. Videos spread claiming he was falling apart. Others insisted he was hiding something painful from the public. It became clear that speculation was turning from curiosity into concern. And Simon knew the time was coming when he would need to address what was really happening. And when Simon finally spoke, his words didn't just confirm the rumors. They revealed a heartbreaking truth that explained everything Richard had been quietly enduring. Finally, after months of silence, Simon Cowell broke his quiet reserve to confirm what fans had been whispering about Richard Goodall. And the truth was far more heartbreaking than anyone expected. Simon explained that Richard had been carrying an emotional burden his entire life, one that was intensified by sudden fame. It wasn't simply nerves, anxiety, or stage fright. Though all of these played a part, it was a lifetime of self-doubt, invisible struggles, and a deeply ingrained fear of not being good enough. The revelation gave fans context for everything they had observed over the course of the show. The gentle demeanor, the moments of hesitation, the intensity behind each note he sang. Simon described Richard as a man whose talent had always been extraordinary, but whose confidence had not kept pace. "I've never seen anyone so talented, and yet so unsure of themselves," Simon said. He had spent decades thinking the world didn't deserve his voice. And suddenly, the world was watching, listening, and expecting him to shine. That was the reality Richard had been living in for months. And for years before that, the weight of expectations he never asked for, layered on top of fears he couldn't easily shed. Those closest to Richard also shared insight into his emotional journey. Crew members noticed that he often needed quiet moments before stepping onto the stage, sometimes retreating to small rooms just to compose himself. Friends revealed he had long battled anxiety, stemming not from fame, but from the lingering belief that his talent was unworthy of attention. Over the years, Richard had learned to hide these struggles beneath humility and politeness. But sudden recognition threatened to expose the vulnerability he had always guarded. Simon's confirmation didn't just validate the rumors. It illuminated the courage Richard had shown every single day. Fans who watched his performances in light of this confirmation saw them differently. The trembling notes, the moments where his voice cracked slightly, the gentle pauses before he launched into powerful high notes, all of it now carried deeper significance. Richard wasn't simply performing. He was pushing through emotional barriers, confronting lifelong fears, and proving to himself that he could finally be seen. And that was more moving than any applause he could receive. Simon also revealed that he had become a protector of sorts, quietly supporting Richard behind the scenes. He adjusted rehearsal schedules, provided encouragement, and made sure Richard had the space to process the overwhelming attention. It wasn't a handout, it was a recognition of the fact that true talent sometimes comes with fragile hearts, and that nurturing that talent meant understanding the person behind it. Simon admitted that few contestants had ever made him feel such a responsibility, and that he had come to respect Richard more than anyone might realize. The confirmation had a ripple effect beyond the show. Social media exploded, not with criticism or speculation, but with support and compassion. Fans began sharing their own stories of self-doubt and resilience, connecting Richard's journey to their own struggles. Teachers, school staff, and ordinary people everywhere resonated with someone who had quietly worked for decades, unseen and underappreciated, only to finally be recognized. His story reminded the world that sometimes the greatest triumphs are not just about winning or fame, they're about survival. Courage and the quiet battles fought behind closed doors. By finally addressing the rumors, Simon Cowell didn't just shed light on Richard Goodall's private struggles. He gave the world a profound lesson in empathy. Fans learned that talent alone is not always enough. Emotional strength, resilience, and the courage to face life's hidden challenges are equally important. Richard's journey, once shrouded in whispers and speculation, became an inspiring story of vulnerability and bravery. It was heartbreaking, yes, but it was also a reminder of the incredible human spirit that can shine, even when weighed down by fear. And as Richard continued to perform, now with the world understanding the challenges he faced, his voice carried not just music, but the triumph of a man who had fought unseen battles for decades, and finally allowed the world to witness the depth of his courage.